Hola de nuevo en el canal Economic Zones. Vamos ahora con otro panel. Hemos conocido hasta ahora paneles de las zonas económicas que trataban muchos aspectos de las zonas económicas, como la regionalización, el crecimiento industrial, la sostenibilidad, la generación de empleo y muchos más. Ahora vamos a centrarnos en su papel de reservas estratégicas, zonas económicas como reservas estratégicas. Iniciamos, pues, el panel BSTRATEGIC. Contamos de nuevo con la presencia inestimable de Courtney Finger. Ella es jefa de redacción del New Statements Media Group y ella moderará otra vez este diálogo. De nuevo, hola.
Hola.
Tenemos también a Douglas van den Berge de Holanda. Hola, Douglas.
Hola, hola.
Que estará conversando con Gökhan Akinci, que es de Turquía, pero nos habla desde USA. Hola, Gökhan.
Hola.
¿Qué tal? ¿Bien?
Bien, tú.
Bien.
Sí,
Good.
muy bien, gracias.
Good morning. Pues nada, os dejo. Adelante.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for those of you who are tuning in. And hello to Douglas and Gökhan. I'll just tell you a little bit about who they are. We're going to be talking about economic zones as strategic reserves. So what can we do to guard against future shocks and try to create stability, and what role these zones have to play in that. And we have two well-known and experienced international advisors to help tell us what to do. We need that. Douglas is a global expert on FDI, special economic zones, competitiveness, and innovation. He's joining us from the Netherlands. Gökhan is a technical leader for the International Finance Corporation's Creating Markets Advisory Team for Sub-Saharan Africa. This is part of the World Bank Group. Gökhan is waking up early today, joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you. I'd like to just ask you for your headline thoughts, your initial ideas on how we build resilience against future shocks. I know that's a kind of a broad brush question. And what strategic approaches should economic zones and government policymakers be taking at this critical moment in the global economy? Douglas, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you for the organization for inviting us and having me on this panel. Excellent, thank you very much. I'll give a very brief introduction on the first question that you really asked, and it's sort of a more philosophical answer as well, because if we think about shocks and creating resilience, and we're talking about economics now, but if you think about shocks in physics or in medical science, it implies something much different, because we are thinking now in terms of shocks and build up resilience from an economic perspective and getting back to the world that we previously lived in. And if you look at the medical science, if you have, for instance, a shock in your health system and you have to go to hospital, let's say you have a stroke or a heart attack, you will recover, and a doctor will tell you, you cannot go back to your previous life because what you were doing with your health was not good enough. Whether there was too much stress, too much coffee, you were overweight or were smoking, whatsoever. Every time you get a shock to your medical system, it implies that you have to do something else. That you have to change your way of life. And this is how I see the current shock as well. And I know this is also, it doesn't really resemble the financial shock in 2008 and the financial recession that we had previously, but this is a health crisis, which cascades into an economic system, obviously. But what I'm trying to say is we need to get rid of the things that we weren't doing well in the past, the smoking, the coffee, the too much stress. And this is what we also need to identify. Where were the symptoms in our economic system that weren't taking good care of our economies as well? And I think that's critical to do now. And I think that's also how we need to see this crisis. Many see this as a huge challenge. In fact, it's not. I think it's the only time that we've lived over the last 100 or maybe 200 years where we get the opportunity to change things radically, to change things and do things differently. And I know we're all, we all need to be there in Barcelona. We all need to travel. But I was talking to Gökhan just prior to this this session, and we said, things will be different, and it'll probably be a combination of having face-to-face meetings, meeting people in person, but also having these webinars and using Zoom and all these technologies that are out there. Okay, so let's not be too philosophical and move to the free zones. The free zones are changing. The context has changed. It will change. A number of things need to be done. Free zones are not just an instrument anymore to attract investment through a nice financial incentive and a real estate package. If you manage a free zone, you're not just a landlord and your investors are tenants. You need to do more. You need to think about the different services that you can provide in the future. You need to think about sustainability. How can you embed sustainability into your policies, into your free zone policies? Secondly, free zones are not just islands of operations. They are embedded in a country. They are part of the business environment of a country. So thinking about how you create those linkages to a local economy and to your local suppliers, and to integrate your free zone as a free zone developer into the economic development goals of your country is going to be crucial. These are just some initial thoughts from my side. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you, Douglas. And if we stick with your health metaphor, what are the bad habits or bad approaches? What is the drinking and smoking of the economic development world?
Well, the drinking and smoking of the economic development world is one of them that I just mentioned. Financial incentives are just not the key to having a successful free zone. It's just one aspect. Think about, and I'm sticking to diets. If you compare free zones around the world, and this is something that I've discussed with some of our corporate investors, it's like going to McDonald's. If you go to McDonald's all around the world, it's more or less, you get the same menu. And this is how it's like also with free zones. If you go to a free zone, wherever it is, in Africa or in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or Latin America, you will basically get the same menu of types of fiscal incentives or financial incentives that you can get anywhere in the world. So people are saying, this is all fine, but I can get there anywhere. So where is the differentiating factor? So this is just one thing that we need to get rid of. And I'm sure we'll identify a number of more, but I also want to give Gökhan the time to introduce as well, get to this topic.
Thank you very much. And what are your prescriptions for us, Gökhan? Oh, we can't hear you. I believe you're muted.
I was muted.
You are. There you go.
I think that's one of the most used, basically, sentences last year.
Exactly.
I was saying, first, great to see you, Courtney and Douglas, and thank you, Barcelona, for organizing this amazing event, and thank you first to all the participants. I would say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So I don't think there's any prescription, Courtney. As always, I'll try to take a step back and really see how we should think about pandemics, resilience, shocks, in a fashion where we anticipate them early on and make them part of our thinking in designing and implementing zone regimes in general. I think in doing so, I see a few buckets. The first bucket is on really integration of the industrial infrastructure initiatives, zone initiatives, being part of countries, regions or cities' overarching economic growth strategy. And in doing so, really understanding what are the global trends and their implications for SEZ development, including shocks, COVID, climate change, issues that we should think about. The third bucket is really focusing on developing an effective ecosystem and coalition of institutions for a sustainable and competitive initiative that is thought through in the medium and long term. And the fourth bucket is really tuning to market demand and how it is shaping by time to help develop scenarios to anticipate changes in that basically sector, in investor and buyer trends, in demand, and how to stay competitive, including anticipating shocks and pandemics and their impact on the sectors that we basically employ in our initiative. And in doing so, there are a number of lessons learned from zone development. And as you know, I actually look at zone development and call it industrial infrastructure in a few buckets, the 1.0, the 2.0, and I think the future of it, the 3.0 concept. In that, what we have learned is when we actually develop a clear vision and objectives of how this initiative will work as part of the economic growth strategy and focus on market demand, we have a better understanding of the specific issues firms, sectors, the value chains are facing and may face due to different sizes and shapes of shocks and changes in global trends, and be more flexible in designing policies, regulations, and our soft and hard infrastructure to respond to that. And part of that is to actually focus on changing of mindset to investor servicing, including immediate and short and medium-term responses to support them in adjusting to ongoing trends and impacts in designing the hard and soft infrastructure. This also comes into play in identifying and addressing regulatory as well as institutional capacity and coordination issues, because when you look at industrial infrastructure initiatives, we are talking about several policies and institutions coming together to make this work. And in that, we also need to understand and stay alive and agile to really understand that we are going into dynamic processes that are multi-sector and multi-institutional and multi-year. And these are not stagnant initiatives, and we cannot stay stagnant in anticipating shocks. And this is part of basically doing our homework in designing these initiatives going forward. And one thing that I should come back and respond to your second question on what is the smoking and drinking of zones, I think smoking and drinking of zones is getting stuck in an older model and not thinking flexibly and not adjusting to the changes in the world and the trends that we need to anticipate and think about.
Thank you, Gökhan. And I know that you've worked a huge amount in sub-Saharan Africa. Are there any special considerations in terms of applying these models in developing countries as opposed to more advanced economies?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, Courtney. I think if we think about Africa especially, or in developing countries, we see a variation of the three concepts I talked about, the 1.0, 2.0, and the 3.0. One of the things I think we need to think about is what do we mean by SEZs? Because the shape and size and the model we have in our minds when we talk about zones are varied. The 1.0 model was, as you know, more of an enclave model with fences around, really focusing on labor arbitrage, attracting FDI to benefit from that, to attract investment and enhance exports. And then the concept improved and moved into more of an SEZ concept that was a lot more flexible, multi-sector, more private sector driven, and government pulled back to more facilitation. But that's also in many cases not dynamic enough. I think in most of our client countries, in developing countries, it's really important to think about the new concept of industrial infrastructure that needs to be more programmatic and part of the overarching competitiveness strategy with collaboration and integration going beyond zones with more and better institutional capacity that responds to changing market demand frequently, not once in a while, and catalyzing innovative approaches and focusing on market and coordination failures. What I mean with that is really looking at what trends are shaping our future in the sectors we are focusing on. And this is not valid only for developing countries, but also more developed, enhanced countries. We know that there is declining trade intensity in goods and growing trade intensity in services. Share of services and logistics are increasing in manufacturing, and there is also increasing knowledge intensity. We have China's restructuring, where there are basically opportunities that may raise from that for developing countries, especially to attract investment. There's a decline in the commodity super cycle and prices. The change, the shape and size and the way it works, modus operandi of global and regional value chains are changing. We saw that with the recent impact from COVID, for example, for nearly all sectors. One example is on apparel, on how people are thinking to actually reshore and integrate it within the regions to be able to respond to these demand shocks. There is climate change that's impacting in how buyers and large firms are really designing to focus and manage their value chains in a more sustainable fashion. We have disruptive technology that's changing everything from fintech to automation to more than 2.7 million industrial robots we have around the globe now. And of course, with the increasing share of services and the way global value chains are working, there is actually a need for different type of skills coming back together. So I think, especially for our developing country clients, it's really important to really understand these changes and what's coming and how sectors are shaping to design more effective hard and soft infrastructure initiatives to respond to that in the medium and long term.
Thank you. Yes, it does seem that many of these changes and trends were happening already, but COVID has been an accelerator of some of them, so we have to be out in front of them. Douglas, I know something you're involved in is advising and training on FDI 4.0. Can you tell us what does that mean and how is it applied to economic zones?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Courtney. Yes, we're involved in how Industry 4.0 impacts the traditional FDI models, and this is work in progress. It's new. We define Industry 4.0 much more holistic, much more broader. It entails how things are produced, how things are made, and how things are sold, and how we live. That's how it impacts our life, and it's not only about different technologies that are being used. If you look at, and it also includes obviously sustainability as well. If you look at economic zones or special economic zones, they're more or less, and Gökhan emphasized that as well, they're oil tankers, they're big, they're difficult to move in some cases, and they're not as agile and as flexible as we would like them to be. And if you think about Industry 4.0, all the technologies that it offers, it can be on the one side, it can be something where zones can focus on in attracting those type of activities, especially the zones or the techno parks or the smaller and agile zones can focus on this. If you look at the bigger companies, the big multinationals, many of the zones think about these are the ones that we really want to attract, but there's a layer underneath that, which are even family-owned business in countries like the United States and Germany, which are extremely well developed, which have a good liquidity position as well. And those are the ones that are gradually, and this is also a process that's been taking place for a number of years, are internationalizing as well. Some of them are in the field of really new technologies. Think about the companies that are already working on some vaccines. There are a number of them. Obviously, there's the big ones like AstraZeneca, etc., the big pharmaceutical companies. But there's a layer underneath there, which are really explorative at new companies that are expanding as well, looking for opportunities to divide their global value chains across borders as well. Another aspect of Industry 4.0 is that it slices up global value chains. And there's a lot that has been said about global value chains, but value chains are also regionalizing. And this is where there's another opportunity for zones to develop. Because if you look at a value chain of a specific industry or of a specific company, it's sliced up. Different parts of the production process are located in different parts of the world, in different economic contexts, in different business environments. And what is not replicated by economic zones or free zones or special economic zones is that you can tap into those value chains by actually collaborating with different free zones across a region or across the world. So you actually create a collaborative platform, zones that are working together, either under one brand name or under different brand names, and which can simultaneously and at the same time and in parallel attract parts of that global value chain in discussions with some of the corporate investors. I haven't really seen that being replicated yet. I know there are some trends across Latin America to do so. I think that's where you can tap into a promising market, especially when you think about these companies that are in the field of Industry 4.0.
Well, and the offshoot of I guess adjacent to Industry 4.0 would be the FDI 4.0 or the Investment Promotion 4.0. Yeah. So how do investment promoters, and that would include people in economic zones trying to attract investment, how do they need to up their game and rethink the way they engage with investors to fit into these trends?
FDI 4.0 is something that we've recently sort of launched as a boot camp and as a strategy to think about the future. What we see today is that there is a lot of emphasis on on attracting investment, thinking very broadly in terms of sectors. But with COVID-19, the emphasis should be much more focused on business retention and business expansion, which is quite important. The whole process of attracting companies that are at the forefront of Industry 4.0 and are the pioneers is a different process. It's even more focused on finding the right talent, collaborating. For instance, some of the big technology companies or even the smaller ones that we have worked with, they don't specifically go to a location because it offers, these, or they want to arbitrage labor costs, or they want to have specific incentives. No, they go to a location where they think there is a ecosystem that supports the further development of their products and services. So they want to go to the universities that are operational. They want to understand better what the capacity and skill sets are of engineers. They want to learn about local companies that are also in sort of the same field of technology development where they are in. So they want to meet these companies and they want to collaborate. And this is also a new way of thinking about economic systems that is embedded in Industry 4.0. We don't really think, the traditional model is about competition. The new model is much more towards collaboration. And this is especially for these technology companies, for companies operating in Industry 4.0. They want to collaborate and share common goals to achieve. So it's not as if a company sort of lands within a free zone. They specifically really want to work together with the suppliers or the local technology companies. So that's one aspect that if you're in investment promotion, you need to think about. How you present yourself is different. How you communicate with the investors is different, and how the services that you provide are also more difficult. And one last thing is the types of incentives that you offer are different as well.
Thank you. And what you're talking about is, in a way, the holistic approach and thinking of the whole ecosystem, which is what Gökhan talked about. Gökhan, are there any positive examples you can point to around the world where this model has been successfully carried out?
Yes, I think when we look at what is happening in a number of our developing countries, countries in Africa such as Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia, for example, have adopted basically their zone regimes to be more flexible, more private sector oriented, more towards an ecosystem type of an SEZ approach. The zones in general, if you look at the way you operate, sit in a very nice spot, a metro level industrial infrastructure ecosystem between economy-wide macroeconomic approaches and firm level approaches. So that gives them a really interesting approach in adapting to changes and FDI as well as investment trends, and look and explore how we can actually design our model in more of a 3.0 shape that actually responds to these demands. So in that sense, if you look at different regions, starting with East Asia, countries have much earlier moved into a model in this regard. And there are different types of examples from Acaba SEZ to Panama Pacifico that has actually adopted these systems early on to bring a more concerted combination of basically public and private sector innovation and partnerships to design systems that will bring in a multi-sector, multi-year and multi-zone of options in their design and development. In doing that, one of the things actually I want to highlight here is the way the countries that has actually been more successful think through in designing their initiatives and ask the hard questions ex ante. I think in the successful cases, what we have seen is the ex ante thinking about how to design these programs to develop more successful initiatives and sustainable initiatives in the medium and long term. In there, I think one of the key questions is which value chains are challenged the most and which ones provide the most opportunity for the country and the regional context. This is a key question actually to ask before we design our policies and legal and regulatory frameworks and the initiative. That's actually what has been in the heart of the successes we have seen globally. And this is also followed up when you look at the resilience issues. The second question is, what are the specific actual and future market challenges and opportunities the country will be responding to, and understand its impact on opportunities well in a fashion where we can retool to focus on immediate and medium-term opportunities. One of the examples is, for example, in a number of countries where apparel sector is basically one of the major sectors they have been able to attract for their SEZs, an immediate focus on shifting to production of PPEs and looking at where the demand is, linking to that demand, exploring and understanding the types of domestic and international standards, and applying them, bringing in support at the firm and the zone level to make sure that those can be applied and skilled in the short term to be able to respond to that short and medium term effectively.
Thank you. And Douglas, I'll ask you a similar question. Who's getting it right? What positive case studies could you point to?
I think getting it 100% right is a challenge, but there are definitely some of the examples that are really outstanding. I think there is some of the zones that have been developed in Latin America are quite promising. Uruguay is an example. Zone America, for instance, is a zone which is you know, since its existence, which is quite some years ago, has had a really forward-looking strategy in terms of how it attracts investments, the infrastructure that has been built, the way not only the hard infrastructure but also the soft infrastructure, the cooperation and collaboration with the local government. So these are the things that really stand out. Some of the zones in Colombia as well. Obviously, the Middle East has different concepts of zones. DMCC, I think, has been an award winner as well in terms of how it sort of does its management of the zone and also incorporates much more smaller companies into their zone. Obviously, the zones in Dubai and in large part in the GCC have a different emphasis and a different objective than some of the zones in Africa. But these are some outstanding examples. Malaysia as well has got some really promising zones. And I think the ones that Gökhan mentioned in Kenya, you know, there's some really promising developments in Africa as well.
Thank you. And when we think about the tools that policymakers at the governmental level have to try to support the development of economic zones, but also to build in this resiliency and lead us into recovery, what's the recommended approach? What can governments do to play a supportive role in all this? I'll ask Gökhan first.
Thank you, Courtney. I think the first thing is really opening up our minds, because being stuck in a focus on the legal regulatory framework and incentives, especially fiscal incentives, has not worked very effectively. So it's really opening up our minds and looking at what are the key market failures and the crisis response issues the ecosystem we need to develop should tackle. And in doing that, we need to also understand that the ecosystem of what will make the new modern zones work and respond effectively to shocks is to understand that we have several policies that needs to come together to work. We are looking at skills, land policies, labor policies, utilities, logistics, climate-related issues, trade issues, linkages, health issues. And in doing that, we also need to understand that this needs to be part of a coalition built on purpose to respond to these, with everybody doing their job in a concerted fashion. And that also includes working closely with not only the national governments, but state as well as municipal city governments that are basically designing policies, for example, on COVID response, working well with the national as well as the regional and city health authorities to make sure the response is integrated. Otherwise, it's not going to be very successful. And following that, we need to also think about what are the essential ecosystem characteristics for this system to work, not only to basically respond to anticipated shocks and design the resilience, but also anticipate what is after the shock, so that we can actually adjust back to the new normal in the sectors we have employed in our basically zones. To understand what's the right institutional capacity and coordination mechanisms how do we actually need to innovate our mechanisms and provide innovation into our thinking, strategy, and firms? How do we best integrate into our local community from a physical planning, healthcare, and social and gender perspective? How do we maximize, for example, transfer of skills, management know-how, and technology to actually be able to respond to the changes in the sectors due to basically these shocks? And a really good understanding of what are the disruptive trends and changes in technologies that are going on or that are upcoming in the sectors we are targeting, and understanding how they may be affected by shocks, by changes in demand, and really thinking about our medium and long-term strategy and being in tune to the markets. And these are the types of things I think that policymakers need to keep in mind. It's basically asking the hard questions ex ante to prepare for future.
Thank you. And Douglas, what would you add to that? And also, could you speak a bit about, we agree that the incentives, perhaps the typical incentives model as a tool isn't necessarily fit for purpose for the future. What kind of incentives are future ready?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Gökhan. I agree with all the points that you made, but let me add a few things here as well. I think, and this is a more conceptual one as well. When you talk, the issues that zones have been confronted with over the last 10 to 20 years was always the love and hate relationship within governments in looking at special economic zones. I think, in general, one could say that the policymakers that are focused on developing industrial policy, the ministries of industry and trade and economics, are the ones that are generally in favor of developing SEZs because they see them as a good instrument to attract investment and generate employment and GDP growth within a country. The other side of the coin is that the other part of the government is usually the ministries of finance, are the ones that not have this specific relationship or not have this specific view in terms of special economic zones. They see them as we're just providing these fiscal incentives for privileged investors. We don't see them as engines of economic growth. And I think that relationship should change. And it changes automatically when you do a number of things. First of all, if you integrate the SEZ policies and strategies within the broader economic development goals, because in essence, any government around the world has a view in terms of where they want to go with the country, how they want to generate employment, generate GDP, how they want to diversify their economy, how they want to be more competitive, etc. So all these goals are different for all different countries. You can imagine that in the GCC, generating more employment is not as urgent as it is in many African countries. So these goals are different. And if you don't integrate the SEZ strategy with your broader economic development goals or integrated in the investment or incentive policy objectives that you have, it's hard to really sell it within a government, and you will not have much support. So that's one of the critical things that needs to be done. In addition, as you mentioned, the incentives, new types of incentives. The incentives, you have the hard incentives. These are the fiscal and financial incentives, the tax issues, the import and export duties. For some of these zones, they remain important. But for other zones, you need to look at new types of incentives that are focused much more on what we would call the soft incentives, providing better services to investors, making sure the one-stop shops that you sell as unique selling point for your free zone really work, whether they are digital or not physical. Looking at sustainable incentives, for instance, incentivizing green types of investments and removal of subsidies that are focused on fossil fuels, for instance. So having a more forward-looking incentive program and tailoring the different incentives to the sectors or subsectors or the value chains you want to attract. There's often a mismatch between the incentives that are being offered by a special economic zone and the ones that the investors or the corporates that are going to be locating within a zone really need. And this mismatch causes also the fact that they don't really see this as a unique selling point or as a specific advantage. The company's not going to be, I always use the example that the company's not going to be making any profits in a specific country or in a specific jurisdiction. Giving a corporate income tax exemption does not make any sense, and it will not be seen as an advantage. but more or less, if the company's going to be training staff, you can think about training subsidies or training programs that are being offered, etc. So there's numerous examples to do that.
Thank you. And both of you mentioned sustainability, and obviously we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were already, we were off track in terms of meeting those goals, and COVID potentially threatens progress there even further. And Gökhan, given your work in developing countries, how do you get the right balance between keeping this focus on sustainability and trying to attract the right kind of investment at a time when there is less liquidity, less investment, less money, government budgets are being slashed? How does that stay a priority at a time of crisis?
This is actually a very interesting question, Courtney. I see this dichotomy on basically many of us thinking about zones, industrial parks, and there are green zones and eco-industrial parks. And I think that is not true anymore. If you look at the challenges we are facing, and if you look at how different sectors are working and need to work into the future, all industrial infrastructures need to be green. And when I say green, I'm not just talking about climate change response, but it's a combination of basically environmental and social sustainability in general. So this is not really anymore a separate topic. It is a must. It is basically in the nature and DNA of zones. It is not. It needs to be going into future. To be able to address future shocks, issues we will face from climate change, including the flooding we had, for example, in Thailand a couple of years ago, and other issues we faced in many other countries, I see this issue needs to be integrated in our ex-ante thinking, in the whole ecosystem, and in DNA of all industrial infrastructure going forward. It may be in different variations, it may be in different degrees, depending on the context, but it's not really anymore a separate topic. And if you look at how firms are now operating, we know that when we are thinking about industrial symbiosis, when we are thinking about energy efficiency, when we are thinking about other tools to address environmental and social sustainability, we also know that these actually also enhance competitiveness of firms. When we do analysis and in our programs that we implement in different parts of the world, from Ethiopia to Bangladesh to Turkey, where we have large basically initiatives on eco-industrial parks or green zones, the actually results are very impressive in terms of response to policy needs, in terms of, for example, reduction in carbon emissions, in terms of better gender practices, in terms of improved water usage, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of managing waste more effectively to turn into, for example, heat for industrial symbiosis purposes. These actually rate of return in use of, for example, solar power, these actually have significant rate of returns in the medium and short term, and those initiatives actually pay back from a firm perspective and from a policy perspective. So I think one of the things we need to understand is that these have to be from now on part of the DNA of our thinking when we design zones, and they are actually not cost increasing, but they are cost reduction and resilience initiatives that actually needs to be embedded in all of our future programs, and actually also in retrofitting what we have in our hands in brownfield initiatives.
Thank you. And Douglas, in your view, how well are economic zones in general globally doing at embedding sustainability into their DNA as Gökhan advises? And a related question is, at a time of fewer FDI projects being out there to attract, how can we ensure that zones stay focused on attracting productive FDI and the right kind of FDI?
Thank you, Courtney, for those questions. I think both of the questions are extremely relevant, and it's sort of providing the holy grail. So But sustainability is recently, I spoke to one of the free zone developers that have done quite successful in Central America, actually, and in other parts of the world. And he actually mentioned sustainability for us in free zone development, and they were actually developing some new technoparks, is not a question, it's become a necessity in essence, because we can't do without it. There is corporate demand that wants us to be sustainable in terms of the whole infrastructure, in terms of the real estate, waste management systems, etc., carbon emissions. And they're taking care of it already using quite the new technologies. But these are the zone developers that have experience that this is relevant. I do think there's differences across the world. I think the traditional zones where a number of business people get together, purchase a piece of land and put a fence around it and say, well, now this is going to be a nice logistics park, and can you help us to develop a strategy to attract investors? I think that's a model that no longer works, and it will not work for the next coming years. So there needs to be a vision, a strategy that's forward-looking and including all those elements. And if you think about sustainability, the SDGs, I think they were launched by the UN Global Compact as well in 2015, with the goal of reaching those goals in 2030. I think all of us agree that it's no news that some of these goals will not be met in 2030. And that's not only the case, that's not only caused by COVID-19, but there's other developments that have, global developments that will probably limit us to reach some of those goals. Although, they are still there, and they not only relate to environmental sustainability, but they also relate to the fact that a free zone and country should create safe places to work, should have equal rights, not only between men and women, but also between different cultures, different race, etc. It should be a safe place. It should be a place to work where you can also develop yourself and where workers have specific rights. All these elements and components are part of the SDGs. And free zones are starting to think about how to integrate it. But in essence, there's only so much free zones can do. Some of these SDG elements and goals and objectives should be part of a broader economic development policy of a country. I think putting the responsibility of realizing some of those SDG goals with special economic zones, I think is over asking what they can achieve. And I think the governments in themselves should put that policy forward, and they should provide the framework under which the SEZs can operate and reach those goals. And they should be part of that stakeholder discussion, the special economic zones. They should be invited because they are instruments and they have a lot of experience in working with investors. And I think what has changed in terms of, there are a number of elements when you talk about sustainability. Are we talking about reaching the SDG goals, or are we talking about attracting sustainable investors, like investors that are in renewables or in solar or are in waste management? Or are we in fact developing a SDG policy framework or strategy for the special economic zones? There are different elements there that need to be discussed. And I think where we are today, and this is also what many of the IPAs do in the world, and Intel has once distinguished between first, second, and third generation of IPAs, and they emphasize the fourth generation of investment promotion agencies, and you could add special economic zones, have sustainability high on the agenda, and it's embedded in their investment strategies and incentive policies. That's not the case yet. We're not there yet. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in that field. But I think that's also where the corporate sector is. It's only a couple of years ago where I think we learned of a company that was based in Southeast Asia that was able to manage plastic packaging material that was 100% degradable. And there was nothing new to that. But the newness was that it was cheaper than traditional plastic packaging material. And this is where the corporate sector is going, okay, here's the bottom line approach. It's better for the environment, but it's also cheaper, and it creates much more profits, because in essence, it's a bottom line approach. And we can think about triple bottom line approaches, etc. People, planet, and profits. But in essence, and this was 2 years ago that this packaging material was developed. And I think that's also where we should go for when we think about SEZs and SEZ strategies.
Is there anything, Gökhan, you'd like to add to that? We've only got about a minute left, but where should the sustainability drive be coming from? Policymakers set from the top from the zones themselves, from the private sector, from the bottom up? Oh, I think you're muted again. Oh, we've lost you.
Right here. Sorry. Yeah. It needs to be a combination of all three, because I think it's an issue of policy, it's an issue of demand, it's an issue of basically firms, and in the medium and long term, basically sustainability in general. Because when we look at the components of this, from firm level energy efficiency to zone level energy efficiency, thinking about resilience, looking at renewable energy, wastewater treatment, cogeneration, industrial symbiosis, it is a combination of bottom-up and top-down. And none of them can actually really ignore the other. But I think it's important in cases for zones to look at their business case and make sure that that signal is given basically upwards in case basically the policymakers are not fully taking this need into consideration. But it needs to be a combination of the whole ecosystem in itself.
Thank you very much. We'll end there. I'd love to talk more with both of you, but we'll have other occasions. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you, Barcelona.
Thank you, Gökhan.
Thank you, Douglas and Gökhan. Thank you very much for your clear and explanations and for your sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And thank you, Courtney.
Thank you.
For being here all these years with us. It's been a real pleasure.
It's my pleasure indeed. Thank you.
See you soon. Y muchas gracias a todos vosotros, asistentes. Gracias también a Servihabitat, nuestro principal patrocinador. Y ahora continuamos con una conexión a Estación de Francia. Allí tiene lugar una Inspirational Talk a cargo de Pilar Jericó. How to face the change in the post-COVID-19. O sea, cómo afrontar el cambio en el post-COVID-19. Nos vemos luego después de esta Inspirational Talk.